All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Slay Security Plus for Tuesday, February 13th, 2024. I'm your host this evening, the Cyber Hamburglar. And I apologize again for having to postpone last night, but here we are, rocking and rolling, and we're ready to go. So I've got a lot to cover, and a little bit of homework for you as well. Just things to kind of dig a little deeper on, stuff that we can't necessarily cover in an hour, or even an hour and a half. But just some of the nuances about the stuff we're going to cover tonight that we'll need a little bit further investigation on your own part. Thank you for coming out, and we'll get rocking and rolling. So we'll be covering Domain 2, Objective 2.3 tonight for Security Plus SY0-701. The objective tonight is to explain various types of vulnerabilities. So we're just going to cover the vulnerabilities themselves. We're going to put all of the how to remediate the vulnerabilities or how to protect against them in another lesson that'll be 2.4. But we're just going to get rocking and rolling on these, and then either Thursday or next week we will shift into 2.4 and kind of piece all this together, kind of give you a full picture. So vulnerabilities. So it is a long list. So we'll start with the application vulnerabilities. So we have race conditions, which essentially is you have two operations that are occurring simultaneously, but one finishes before the other, and that is normal operation. But if it happens in the obverse, it can have ramifications of leaking data. It can cause processes to fail. It can cause memory dumps. It can cause a lot of big issues. One of the examples that was explained to me was years ago purchasing like for Candy Crush or something like that. You go on the App Store and you buy your currency for it and you redeem it in the application. But if you shut down the application quick enough, you can keep redeeming it. And so it'll give you the credit on your phone, but the server side didn't see that until you let it actually sync up. And then it would just go, oh, well, you've just redeemed $500 worth of it because you just kept resetting your phone for 100 times at $5 a pop. So you essentially steal money from that company because that time of check versus the time of use. So when the system is verifying the access or the actual incident that is going on versus when you're actually using that particular resource. So you're using it, but it's not giving it time to check back with the server. So you get repeated uses and are able to take advantage of that weakness in the programming. So you can put in certain controls to limit the time of check, time of use failures. A lot of it comes down to just-in-time permissions. So you do not give permissions for a certain process or a certain resource until it is actually requested. And as soon as it's been utilized, those permissions are revoked until the next time that permission is required again. So programming in things like that to be able to fix that time of check, time of use conflict is one of the ways to resolve race conditions. But it's kind of like you think about a finish line and two cars headed towards the finish line. Different results depending on which one finishes first. So you can also kind of think about it the way that an easy way to understand it is like mathematical operations. If you have 2 + 2 times 6 and there's no parentheses, you're going to do 2 times 6 plus 2. But if you have the 2 + 2 in parentheses, you're going to do that operation first. So being able to put in those requirements and those stipulations that this can't actually be executed until this other part is done allows you to get the correct answer, or depending on how it's formatted, of course, in a mathematical operation. Malicious updates. This is something that code signing would resolve. Essentially, an attacker being able to deploy a fake patch. putting in their own backdoor, putting in a weakness that they can exploit to get data leaks, that kind of stuff. Good evening, Space Tacos and Justin Rower. Thank you all for coming out. Good to see y'all over there on YouTube. Looks like we got a couple on YouTube and one hanging out on Twitch. Buffer overflows. These you will see quite a bit as you do CTFs and things like that. It's some people refer to it as smashing the stack. You're smashing the application stack and forcing the application to dump memory. Essentially, you are overfilling the buffer, so you're overfilling the glass of water, and whatever overflows goes into somebody else's memory address space, and that application runs that code. So it could be the operating system runs it, it could be a concurrent process that's running, but it gets dumped into that and it runs and allows the attacker to traverse directories or to download a malicious executable. Various things can happen when you're doing that. It can even just be as simple as dumping data to be easily read by anybody. So it just depends on the situation, depends on the program. But you will see, anytime you see something on the exam that it talks about the buffer and executable code, it is always buffer overflow or memory injection. You'll see those two terms kind of used concurrently in the exam. So our web-based vulnerabilities, these ones are where you're going to have a little bit of extra homework. So SQL injection is pretty straightforward. You see this right here where it's student ID equals 117 or 1 equals 1 semicolon. And that right there is your SQL statement. That is a query to the database. If you left off the or 1 equals 1, that right there is querying student ID 117. But if you don't have a password for it or something like that, you use a function like the 1 equals 1, which is true. It will dump every record from the database. So the attacker puts that in, it goes through the application programming interface, goes to the SQL database server, and then that 1 equal 1 causes it to dump all the data for all the students in that particular database. So the attacker can see everything that is affiliated with it. Some more complicated queries, you pretty much, you can get it to dump table names, you can get it to dump all the different databases that are on that particular server. You can delete, you can modify. There's a lot you can do, unless you're using, essentially being able to cleanse or to be able to require that the formatting of the queries are sanitized before they make it to that database. So something like this 1 equals 1, you put in a restriction that cannot be entered, or if it is, that query is no longer, it just gets dumped. You don't get a result from it. It's an invalid query. But on the exam, whenever you see something like this, or 1 equals 1, it could be or 7 equals 7. It could be anything, as long as it is a true statement after the or, that is going to be a SQL injection. You're going to see, it could be select from students. It could just be a URL like this, but that is going to be your essentially your indicator that it's SQL injection. That's going to be the answer for that particular exam question. Cross-site scripting, you get a couple different variations on it. You get reflected, you've got stored cross-site scripting, but there are better people out there to talk about cross-site scripting than myself, because it's not something that I've spent a whole lot of time personally working with, but just being familiar with how it works. You're essentially injecting a script into a link, so it can be as a part of the actual link itself. So very similar to the SQL injection, where you have a script that runs. It can be JavaScript, it can be PHP, whatever it is, but you have it as part of the URL. So when you have that URL and the victim clicks on it, and it'll go to the legitimate website, but that script is going to run and it's going to pull data from the victim computer, or it's going to pull session data, cookies, things like that, send them over to the attacker so they have access to that session or to whatever's being communicated between the victim and the website. So both ways kind of similar but different. One, you're going directly at the victim, and then the other, you are going at the website. You have a malicious script. So if it's like a job board or forums or something like that, and they don't have any sort of scrubbing to pull code that doesn't belong, it can be sitting on a message board, and you click that page. Every time that page is opened, that script is going to run on the computer, and then that session cookie, that browser data is going to be sent to the attacker from the victim's computer. So hardware vulnerabilities. This one, it is, you gotta patch it. Really, it comes down to being able to keep up with what is going on. So slap a fix on it when you have vulnerable devices. That can be a couple different things. It could be the firmware itself could be vulnerable. Firmware is your interface between the hardware and the software for your device. So it is essentially what allows the software to communicate through and leverage the hardware. So if you have IoT devices that don't allow firmware updates, but somebody's able to gain access to that, it can give them very highly elevated permissions, and permissions that may not be detectable. They might be able to do stuff that looks like normal traffic coming from a thermostat, but in fact, it's actually a part of a botnet, and it's doing a distributed denial of service attack. It'd be harder to detect, but like endpoint monitoring may not pick that up because it's running below the software layer. It's not running at the operating system layer. End of life and legacy hardware, the old stuff, the stuff that end of life, it's no longer supported. Legacy hardware could be stuff that's still supported, but it's a couple generations behind. They're still putting out patches for it, but it's not getting any of the new features, things like that. Can create weak points in your network. So end of life hardware should always be retired once it reaches end of life, unless in some cases, like for example, like Windows, Windows 7 had an end of life, but then for companies, they could purchase extended support for it. So some of that end of life hardware, depending on how much of that hardware you purchase, you may be able to negotiate for extended support from the manufacturer. But for the most part, that stuff needs to be retired. It has a finite lifespan and needs to be taken off the network, or it needs to be segmented out of the production network and to where it has no impact on the actual security of the network. Same with legacy hardware. Again, you got to be aware of what's in your network. If you've got an old switch or an old router sitting there, and maybe getting updates, but it's not getting the same quality updates, where it doesn't have the same technology that some of the newer appliances on your network have, that could still lead to threat vectors. An attacker may find a loophole in it, and because there's so few of them out in the market, you may be the only person to attack, or there may only be a few people that are attacked, but that 0 day might not get recognized very quickly because it's going to be a smaller pool of people being impacted. And again, that comes back to 0 days. Essentially, that is day 0 for an attack. Nobody knew about it. Nobody had a patch for it, anything like that. It is patient 0. That is day 0. That is day 1, essentially, of the attacks. So that is when the counter starts, is on day 0. And then when you dig into it, as far as we go kind of into firmware with the BIOS and UEFI. So BIOS has been kind of pretty much retired at this point. You don't see a whole lot running, at least as far as computers go, your mainstream PCs running BIOS anymore. For the most part, it is the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, the UEFI. UEFI has a lot more security because the bootloader is separated and is secured. So it looks and sees that everything checks out the way that it should be before it launches into the kernel. Whereas with the BIOS, you could have a corrupted master boot record that's sitting on the hard drive, and then it pumps into the bootloader from there. But this firmware interface is isolated from your hard drive. It's isolated from a lot of the rest of the systems in the computer. So when it starts up, it is on its own island before it loads up the bootloader and then the kernel to bring up your operating system. So it gives an extra layer of security versus the old school master boot record, I know there are probably a few of you out there who have actually experienced that, where you have a corrupted master boot record, or you get a rootkit that gets stuck on the MBR, and it is near impossible to clean off. I mean, pretty much, I mean, years ago, you had to have either special tools or you got rid of the hard drive and you started over from scratch. There wasn't a whole lot to be done there. Virtualization vulnerabilities. This one is going to spread beyond just virtualization. It kind of spreads into cloud, which I want to cover in a different session as well, because cloud, as far as security and vulnerabilities, goes pretty deep, especially on the 701 exam. There's a lot of coverage on cloud, and rightfully so. We have a lot of cloud interface now. A lot of companies are running hybrid networks, so having visibility and understanding of the cloud is absolutely key for us defenders. So the main ones that CompTIA wants you to know are virtual machine escape, which I've got a diagram here on the right that I'll cover, which essentially an attacker gets access to a virtual machine and then leverages that machine to take resources from other machines or to move laterally into other machines. And from there, finding weaknesses in those machines and being able to escape out to the hypervisor, which essentially is your controller for all of these virtual machines. It is the resource coordinator. So if you're able to get into that hypervisor, you have access to that whole computer. You have access to all of the virtual machines. You can change security controls. You can create a lot of havoc getting that level of access. But from there, because that is a server sitting on a network somewhere, it gives you access to the other servers, the other host systems that are sitting out there, and allows you to further access data, credentials, whatever is sitting out there on the network that an attacker wants to get hold of. And you can move throughout the network once you get to that level. Because a lot of times your VMs, they're going to be segmented. They're going to be on their own separate network, so to speak. But once you're able to escape that virtual machine and get to the base hypervisor or to the host system, then it gives you access to a completely different network that's could be a lot more damaging, because then you get into this system and you have access to all these VMs because you have the permissions to run all of these, so you have access into all of them. Can be very, very bad. A lot of times you see issues with that. If you have hypervisors that are hosting multiple machines that are varied levels of security. So you have, like here, it's got a marketing server, a sales server, a web server. So you might have some that are Windows, some that are Linux, and setting up those controls and those security requirements to have parity between them is going to be tough. So if you don't, that leaves you open to weaknesses to where that VM escape could potentially happen. So a lot of the times, like in an enterprise environment, like at General Electric where I work, a lot of the servers, you will see that there's only Red Hat Linux runs on this particular host system. All of the virtual machines are Red Hat at a certain level. If we have one group running Red Hat 7, then another group running Red Hat 8, they're on two different host systems. We don't mix and match. Everything is uniform across that hypervisor. It makes it easier to configure and easier to secure. VM sprawl, you'll kind of hear this get tied in with shadow IT. So essentially, users creating their own services or machines and then forgetting about them. So going and spinning up a machine on AWS and then just letting it sit there and run away. And it creates unexpected costs, because you have this machine just sitting out there running processor time, running storage. And if somebody forgets about it and it's not logged into your configuration database, that server is going to sit there unpatched. Nobody's monitoring it. And it leaves a foothold for an attacker to get onto your network. So limiting the creation of virtual machines to actual teams and actual people who are responsible and own those machines and have to go through a certain process of entering it in the configuration database and putting them on a patching schedule, having maintenance schedules on these things is absolutely key. So not letting Carl have fun in accounting and spin up his own web server because he has access to the AWS account. All that stuff should be locked down and should be limited in who actually has access to it. Resource reuse. This one, it's often in cloud services. It can happen on your local networks as well if you decommission a server and then spin something up on top of it, but the impact is not going to be as significant. The problem in cloud is that if you spin up an EC2 instance on AWS, you have essentially a web server running, and you have data on that server, and then you shut it all down, and you go and start up another one. It's not starting in the same spot. You're not going to get to reuse that same hard drive and that same sector on that, or the same exact server even. So that data that you had sitting in that EC2 instance is out in the void. And somebody eventually is going to get assigned that space. There's going to be residual data resting on that hard drive. And while it may not be formatted and it might not be easily readable, you could go in with forensic tools and be able to see some, if not all, of that data. So things like crypto shredding, things like that, where you go and encrypt all that data before you decommission it and then destroy the encryption key, is absolutely necessary in cloud services. Being able to essentially shred the data and get it, you can't, because you can't remove it, you can't destroy the hard drive, so you've got to have another way to do it. So crypto shredding, essentially encrypting it and then destroying the encryption key, will help prevent that data from being leaked inadvertently because of the nature of the cloud and how things are instanced and brought up and brought down. Supply chain vulnerabilities. This one's always interesting to me, and it is essentially where you buy X, Y, or Z. So whether you're buying services, whether you're buying hardware or buying software, attackers can get a foothold in anywhere along the line, from the chips being made for your hardware to the software. If they get into the GitHub and get into the CI/CD pipeline, being able to put in code. I mean, they can almost go undetected if you don't have a process in place to be able to identify where your components are coming from, who's producing your firmware or producing the hardware for your network equipment. Hardware providers, there's a thing called Trusted Foundry, which essentially is it's trusted suppliers that have vetted pipelines and security along the way through their production. Now, something like a graphics card, if you're buying from NVIDIA or from AMD, if you buy a Trusted Foundry part, it's going to be a whole lot more expensive because of the additional legwork that has to go in to certify these components, as opposed to one that, they may have chips that are made in China, or they are made in a less secure facility that, you could potentially have a compromise along the production pipeline. With service providers, this one you've seen in the past with ransomware and some of the news over the past few years. The service provider essentially gets hacked, and this could be your SaaS provider, it could be a managed service provider or a managed security service provider. Any third party that provides a service to you, a compromise in their services gives that attacker trusted access to your data and assets. So you are the partner third party, and your MSSP gets hacked. Well, all of a sudden, all those remote access tools, they have access to your data and your assets and your network, and they have free reign because they're covering their tracks. Nobody can see what they're doing, or they're not catching it because they've shut down the systems at the MSSP or blocked their visibility into what they're doing and stealing your data. So it all comes kind of back to third-party risk and having service level agreements, and a lot of stuff that goes back to the legal department. How who's responsible in an event that a data breach happens at your company because of your MSSP? Well, technically, it's still your data that gets leaked. It's still your problem. But do you have any recourse against your third-party partners at that point? And is there anything insurance-wise, anything to help you recover from that attack in that event? And then software providers. This one, who was it? SolarWinds was the big one a few years ago, and still seeing trickles of that from time to time. But essentially, an APT, an advanced persistent threat, got into SolarWinds CI/CD pipeline and wrote code. Nobody noticed the code, and it gets pushed into production. And so anybody purchasing SolarWinds products has this code in their network, and it allows a foothold into all of SolarWinds customers. You can kind of see where that's a bad thing. I mean, at that point, you are a major provider of software, and somebody has intentionally developed malicious code or vulnerable code and given themselves a foothold into your network. So that kind of comes down into the manufacturing and assembly part of the supply chain, but also poor coding practices, not having logging on who's making these changes or what changes are actually being made, not having pair programming, so somebody's reviewing what somebody else is writing. There's a lot of different factors that can fall into that. And then, I mean, yeah, restricted and prohibited code. If you have restrictions in there, certain code is not allowed to be in there because it reaches out to a server that we don't know what it is. Having restrictions on your CI/CD pipeline before that stuff gets pushed into production is absolutely key. But that supply chain, I mean, it can come down to bootleg software that's being hosted on illegitimate websites or illegitimate code repositories. Seen some of it with people putting up fake packages up online, and people are pulling those into their legitimate software and being able to hijack the legit software just because they downloaded a package that looked similar to the official one. Or maybe it had some additional functionality, but nobody said anything about the malicious code that's buried in there. But essentially knowing where your code comes from is absolutely key for security. And mobile device vulnerabilities. This really comes down to, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I mean, years ago, we jailbroke our iPhones. It was cool to be able to load apps on there that that Apple didn't let you do, or be able to get music on there that it's harder to get it through iTunes and get it onto the phone, but you could put a different app on there and load up all your MP3s and everything worked perfectly fine. But jailbreaking, you get root access to the device configurations and operations. It gives you the top level access to everything in that device. When you do that, it makes it way easier to install malware, to install applications that can track, can steal data, even to the point of being able to hijack your SIM and being able to clone your phone, essentially. And that kind of falls into side loading as well. You'll see people like myself with an Android, and you will go and download an application from APK Pure or one of the APK websites, and you put the phone in developer mode, and you can sideload applications in that, an application that hasn't been in production for 2 or 3 years. Well, cool. You've got the application and it works, but what vulnerabilities is that application introducing to your phone? What security weaknesses in communication, or what vulnerabilities in its communication to servers are you not seeing, and could an attacker be exploiting? So those applications that are sideloaded, your app stores do not scan them for security. I know my phone will tell me every time I boot it up, we've scanned all your applications, everything checks out. But if I have something on there that's not approved, it'll actually give me a warning and say, hey, you need to check out this app. We don't know who installed it, and we don't recognize this. And then automatic updates. I mean, if it's somebody's homebrew application, you're not going to get automatic updates. And again, introducing security flaws. And then kind of akin to sideloading, malware and spyware. I mean, those are vulnerabilities. You click on the wrong thing. Get Pegasus spyware. It's a no-click spyware for iPhones. Hopefully none of y'all are on the radar of foreign governments or anything like that may use it. But it's a real possibility. There are ways to load malware and spyware on both iPhones and Androids. That being said, it is easier on Android phones given the open source nature of their operating system, but just something to be aware of on both sets of devices. And so that is the presentation for this evening. We do have some quiz questions prepared. Yeah, Chris, I don't know. I'm just going to say hi to my personal FBI agent tonight. But he knows that I don't hide anything from him. He's got a camera literally pointed at me all day. And God knows how many microphones sitting here on my desk. So yeah, hi, FBI agent, and hope all's well. But if anybody would like to join in and do some quiz questions this evening, hop on to vvox.app and punch in the ID code 177532244, or scan that QR code and it will load it right up for you. And I just realized I didn't have any music playing. So I'm going to play some music and get this started. All right. Stuck between my monitors here. All right. We are full screen and ready to roll. Go ahead and get the first question up and let y'all get logged in. So first question is, while reviewing web logs for her organization's website, Kathleen discovers the entry shown here. Git http://example.com viewarticle.php !view /config.text. What type of attack has she potentially discovered? Now, this is one of our web-based vulnerabilities. We've got a server running that doesn't have user input cleansing that be able to remove malicious inputs. You can put pretty much anything after that equals in query databases. You can move around, you can pull data you might not or probably shouldn't be able to pull. I'll give y'all another minute here, get a couple more answers in. Yeah, Chris, I wonder about the FBI because I've got friends that have gone into working for the government and have had background checks, so I know I've come up in it. I wonder if I'm on their radar at all. All right, so we'll go ahead on to the next question here. We'll close this one out. Yeah, they work for Dell, and they call you up telling you have a issue with your HP computer. Try to get remote access to your computer. All right, so directory traversal attack, that is correct. So if you're familiar with command line using the CLI, whether it's Windows command prompt using PowerShell or using command line in Linux, whatever your favorite flavor is, that /// takes you back to the root directory, or takes you down a few directories, and then you're looking for that config.txt so you can view the configuration of that particular web server. So that will give you key information on what software it's running, what security measures may be in place, how it's been hardened, if at all, and give you potential other attack vectors. So let's see here. Yeah, so common directory names, file names. That's another thing, and some people say it's worth it, some people say it's not. Security through obscurity. If you change that config.txt to the purple.txt, probably be a little harder for an attacker to find it. Or if you have it as a series of numbers, it may make it harder for them to be able to find it. Having a way to obscure file names and even some directory names can certainly be useful. It is not a web application buffer overflow. We're not entering in any code here. Again, XML injection, we're not entering in any code, and a / attack, though it sounds kind of cool, is not a real thing. So Kara wants to protect against the most common means of firmware-based exploits. Which of the following is not a common firmware defense mechanism for the vendors of devices that use firmware? So we have using firmware updates, using signed firmware updates, using validation for user input, encrypting firmware, and code review processes for firmware. So which of the following is not a common firmware defense mechanism? Why are you chewing on my hand? Yeah. Say hi to everybody. Hi, Slay Security Plus. Thank you. All right, so I'll give you all another 10-15 seconds here to get answers in, and we will move on to the next question. All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll here. Using validation for user input. Oh, sorry about that. Let me go back here. I can figure out how to go back. Well, I'm just clicking things. Get us back a question here. All right. Let's show the results on this one here. It's like I've never used this before. Okay. Okay. There we go. Oh. Well, that was way easier than I thought it was. All right, so we'll go ahead and close it. Sorry for my technical difficulties here. Wow. It's not going to give me my answer. That's fantastic. Why are you not giving me my answer? All right, well, we'll come back to that one. I'll figure it out towards the end here. But the correct answer should be using validation for user input on that one. Encrypting the firmware is absolutely common. Using signed firmware updates, absolutely, and using code review processes, all are secure coding practices. So the other question is, take us back over here to 3. There we are. Under what circumstances are concurrent sessions most commonly considered indicators of compromise? Not necessarily something we covered tonight, but just a good one to cover anyhow. But when they occur on 2 different systems issued to the same user, when they occur on the same system, when they occur in 2 different locations at the same time, or when they occur in the same location at the same time. All right, so we got a couple answers in. Go ahead and see what survey says. All right, so 2 answers: when they occur on 2 different systems issued to the same user, or when they occur in 2 different locations at the same time. So I agree with the 2 different locations at the same time, because it's hard to be in 2 places at once unless you're Superman. Then you probably could be in the same place within a few minutes, or 2 different places within a few minutes. So 2 different systems issued to the same user. So if I had 2 work laptops and was logged into the same website, but I knew that those systems were issued to me, or if I was logging in mobile and on my laptop to the same application, that would not necessarily be an indicator of compromise. Now, if it was one system issued to that user and then one issued to another user, we might have something going on there, because you're using credentials on a different system. Occurring in 2 different locations at the same time is absolutely a problem. If you have somebody logging in from Eastern Europe, and your user is located in Michigan and they're logged in at the exact same time, you've probably got a problem. So that is absolutely an indicator of compromise. So yeah, event occurs in 2 different locations, particularly if travel between them would be classified as impossible travel. I had somebody I met at the Atlanta Cybersecurity Summit a couple weeks ago, and he has a satellite internet connection. He said that he used to get a call from his help desk, or his CERT from time to time, his incident response team, that he would be logged in on his phone in like Massachusetts, and then it would show him in Michigan in like 20 minutes. And it was because of where the satellite location was, it was flagging a different actual location than where he in fact was. So he would get a call about being asked if he was Superman or not, being able to be in 2 locations at the same time, or being able to travel halfway across the country in no time at all. So Michael is performing a forensic analysis of a compromised workstation and discovers a copy of command.exe in the system32 folder. on a Windows workstation that does not match the real command.exe file. When he looks at the file, he discovers that it is capable of running as an administrator. What type of attack has he discovered? This one will be a little tricky. But there's a couple keywords in here that I lean on when I'm looking at it. And we'll go ahead and close our poll here. But a privilege escalation attack is going to be my preferred answer here. The ability to run a program as a privileged user like an administrator from an unexpected or uncommon location is a common indicator of privilege escalation. It's a buffer overflow to push data into a variable to attempt it to take a desired action. So getting another application or another service to run a command for you. And a Trojan would look like a desirable file, but would be malware. And then replay attacks just send successful authentication or other system or other information to gain access to a system. So essentially leveraging credentials or authorization from one system to get access on another system. So absolutely privilege escalation. But when looking at questions like this, you see things like is capable of running as an administrator. That immediately puts me onto privilege escalation attack. While somebody could have disguised that command.exe as it could be a Trojan. When the question kind of gives you other indicators, start leaning on those indicators a little bit and just pick the best answer out of the bunch. Charles is worried about users conducting SQL injection attacks. Which of the following solutions will best address his concerns? So is it using secure session management, enabling logging on the database, performing user input validation, or implementing TLS? So if we think about the SQL injection attacks where you're entering in that 1 = 1 to get it to dump an entire database, and what do you do to prevent that from happening? How do you prevent somebody from typing something in? So logging, you'd probably be able to see when somebody does something like that. They put in a malicious command in order to dump the entire contents of the database. But the answer we are looking for is performing user input validation. So user input validation will strip out any SQL code or other unwanted input. So things like the 1 = 1 or delete table, things like that can cause damage to a database. You can have essentially oftentimes a web application firewall, or you can even have a system on the server that any of those commands go through first. It strips out any of the code, or it completely blocks those inputs, so it doesn't dump the database and doesn't allow modification of the database without direct access to that database from the server itself. Secure session management can help prevent session hijacking, but it's not going to prevent SQL injection attacks. And then logging could be useful to be able to see the attacks, but it's not gonna prevent anything. And then TLS protects network traffic, but only input validation is the correct answer here. So the application that Scott is writing has a flaw that occurs when 2 operations are attempted at the same time, resulting in unexpected results when the 2 actions do not occur in the expected order. What type of flaw does the application have? So we did cover this tonight. This was the first slide tonight. Yeah, you're getting antsy. I know. You have a few more minutes to hang out. So what type of flaw does the application have? And we're talking about two actions that do not occur in the expected order. So the dereferencing, a race condition, insecure function, or improper error handling. So this is one of those questions. It's what is the best solution here? What is the best answer? So race condition, got it. That is absolutely correct. So multiple operations cause undesirable results due to their order of completion. So they're not being completed in the proper order, so they are not operating properly. Dereferencing accesses or uses a memory pointer. So it essentially points at a different sector of the memory to be able to pull data out of it. Not something that we would be dealing with two operations being attempted at the same time. Typically see that more with typically more with memory injection or buffer overflow. Insecure function, it would have security issues in the function itself. So you have maybe an API key that's exposed in the code, or you have essentially excessive permissions for a certain function. Things like that could be security issues in the function itself. Improper error handling would be if you have an error that pops up and it just crashes the application instead of saying that wasn't the input we're looking for, try again. So improper error handling is essentially more for user experience than anything else, but also being able to report back errors and give feedback to the user why an error is occurring. So Frank is investigating a security incident where the attacker entered a very long string into an input field, which was followed by a system command. What type of attack likely took place? So we have a buffer overflow, command injection, server-side request forgery, or cross-site request forgery. Both of which on the server-side and cross-site request forgeries, you don't typically see a whole lot on the exam on those. You might see one, maybe two questions. They're not super common, at least as far as the exam questions go. But when we're looking at that as well, in the question itself, I don't see anything where it's talking about certain requests being put in and somebody trying to gain access to the server. Like, it's not being very particular about how a server-side or a cross-site request forgery would work. So those definitely would not be top of my choices for answers on this one. But the other two, your buffer overflow and command injection, could certainly be either one, but buffer overflow is what we're looking for, because you're essentially looking at that input field is likely going to have a fixed length that it will accept, and then anything past that is going to dump over into the next input field or the next line of code for the application to run after that input field is processed. And that's when that system command will be run and either establish a remote shell, be able to give you privileged access into the system. It could do any one of a number of things. It could completely crash the system depending on the attacker's desires. Could be a rm-rf, pretty much delete the entire file system. So you never know. It's all up to the attacker's motivations. So Ricky is concerned that developers in his organization make use of third-party code in their applications, which may introduce unknown vulnerabilities. He's concerned about the risk of the organization running code that it is not aware it is using. Which of the following activities would best address this risk? We've got web application firewalls, package monitoring, static analysis, or dynamic analysis. So this is another one of my favorites. Which of these is the best answer? Three of them are definitely possible answers when you're dealing with code, and especially third-party code, but only one of them really makes the most sense here. Yeah, Chris, it is definitely a tricky question. It's like, what would the best answer here be? And it's looking at the keywords in the question and talking about third party code, and how do you control that? And so when I think about it, I'm thinking libraries and stuff like that, you're probably not going to sit there and go and analyze the entire library for vulnerabilities. So you're not going to, and dynamic analysis is going to be while something's running. Static is going to be, you're looking like you have something actually analyzing the code itself. Dynamic is the performance of the code. Yeah, they definitely do a good job on these questions, but that's what we're here for. We're here to prepare on this kind of stuff, and choosing the difficult questions when it comes time to get to the exam, it's a lot easier if you practice on the hard ones first. So package monitoring, y'all got it. That is absolutely it. So having package monitoring would allow them to inventory and monitor the third-party libraries that they use. So that is absolutely the best answer. I know in our organization, we actually have authorized libraries that we use. Like, we have entire servers that are essentially just for package management for our Linux systems and for our developers. So they can't use anything outside of what we already have within the organization. So it gives us a lot of control over the actual software that is developed. Any programs, we know what third-party libraries are in there, and then of course any vulnerabilities associated with those, because we have an inventory of exactly which ones are being used. Yeah, application security, that is absolutely it. And only becoming more and more prevalent. Just everything's going to something as a service, so it's more and more application security as we continue going. So Joe checks his web server logs and sees that somebody sent over the following query string to an application running on the server. HTTP, mycompany.com, service status PHP, service ID 892, and service ID 892, %20 drop, %20 table, %20 services. What type of attack was most likely attempted? So this is a tricky one if you're not super familiar with it, especially SQL. But drop table essentially is a kind of like delete, like it's a delete function essentially. It removes that table from the database. So when I look at the answers here and I see something like this, I know that it's not cross-site scripting. I know it's not session hijacking. It doesn't appear to be an on-path attack because it's not somebody sitting in between and eavesdropping or altering data. But when I think SQL, I think I've got parameters. That's really the only answer here that makes sense, because you've got two parameters that are in here, and it's leveraging that parameter and by polluting it, is able to get that command to run on the SQL server and drop that table. That is it. So yeah, that is a parameter pollution attack. So most of the time on CompTIA, they're not going to ask you like, is it a parameter pollution attack, or is it a database query or a database dump attack, that kind of stuff, like where they're trying to figure out how much do you know about SQL injection. It's probably just going to say, what is this? Is it session hijacking SQL injection? More often than not. But knowing a little bit about SQL injection and the different functions, even just a high level understanding will definitely help on the exam. But so yeah, here it's using parameter pollution to slip past content filtering technology. So by leveraging that first parameter and then combining it with the second one, and then using the %20 in there, can allow you to bypass it, because it may be looking for the apostrophe space semicolon drop space table. So using things like the %20s to encode do character encoding can absolutely sometimes pass or bypass content filtering technology. All right, that is everything. Ooh. We're rocking and rolling tonight. Oh yeah, we had. Oh yeah, question number 2. That one. 2? No, 4. We'll go back and do number 4 again. I think I somehow skipped this one. Jill is conducting a penetration test and uses the following query against a vulnerable web application. What data will she see if it succeeds? Select star from users where category equals customers or 1 equals 1. So this is a pretty standard SQL query. So essentially the way it reads out is select everything from table users where category is customers or true. I'll give you just a minute to get answers in. Oh, looks like we're changing some answers now. I'll give you a few more seconds here, then I'm going to go ahead and close the poll up and we'll wrap up for the evening. My dogs are going absolutely crazy upstairs. What are they barking at, huh? A list of all customers or a list of all users? So yeah, it will match all categories. It looks for categories that match customers or true, which is how 1 equals 1 resolves. So that any category will match. Will just provide Jill a list of all users, not just all customers or customers with specific user IDs. That is absolutely correct. So it will give you both. All right. Hey, exit on out of here. One thing I did want to say, we're talking about vulnerabilities and things like that. The damn vulnerable web application. This is a great learning tool. The GitHub here, DigiNinja. Essentially, it is a completely vulnerable web server, and you can. I would just set this up on a virtual machine on your local computer, and that way you can connect to it locally and utilize your machine just working with the web server running on your actual machine, and not facing the internet or anything like that. But it is absolutely fantastic for practicing things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. There are tons of walkthroughs on how to set it all up. There's even automated installations that this guy I Am Karen has set up. But very, very cool, very useful tool for practicing and kind of witnessing what SQL injections, what cross-site scripting looks like when you punch in some of these queries and seeing how the server actually reacts. Absolutely worth the time looking into and digging into. So I would recommend that, especially since I did say that there was some homework, and that is to dig into cross-site scripting and SQL injections, because you will see them day in, day out in cybersecurity. I'm pretty sure they even have modules in here for cross-site request forgeries as well. But essentially this whole program is set up to be extremely vulnerable. So I would absolutely dig into this. Mithril Beata, thank you for coming out. We're actually wrapping up the stream for this evening, but it is recorded to YouTube and will be available for replay as soon as I close everything up. But yeah, I've gotta get rolling here. I got some antsy dogs. I got an antsy little puppy here in my lap that she's probably got to go outside, but she's been patiently chewing on my finger most of the time while I've been teaching tonight. But if there is anything I can do for any one of y'all, any topics that you're struggling with, or you just have questions on anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Find me on the Discord at Cyber Hamburglar. Find me on LinkedIn, Taylor McDonald, and I'll stay secure. We'll see you next time.